And I think that what the Conservatives need is a clarity of purpose and strategy. They need cut-through. And that means a very clear, decisive conclusion about what sort of campaign they're going to mount, what the question is they want to be uppermost in voters' minds when they go into the polling booth. And I think that, toxic as he is, he is a fairly practiced and well-experienced campaigner, Cummings, and I think he could bring that clarity.
Big election year. Could be the autumn, could be May. Everyone still settled on when they think it's going to be?
I'm still a possible May man.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I still think they should go in May, but they won't. They'll go in the autumn.
Well, the government has now briefed out that it will certainly be next year, which gives me even more confidence
This year.
that it'll be.
This
Sorry.
year.
Oh, yeah, that's what they said it last year. What?
But you still think it might be
I'm not good at
2025?
January.
It might just cling on.
Well, yeah, because they were so clear that it will definitely be in 2024, but didn't specify when. Yeah, I don't trust him.
Should Rishi Sunak rule out publicly a May election if he's not going to do one, or risk the sort of Gordon Brown, Bottler Brown thing? That if the idea that he's going to go in May gets legs, is that a risk for him?
He should make sure to brief out that it's unlikely, so as not to build up a head of steam. But he shouldn't rule it out altogether because he doesn't want to close down his options.
He should
but if he doesn't
brief
want
out
to go,
that
then he
he'll
should
hold
do
an
that.
election when it's in the best interest of the country.
Yeah, but the problem then is,
Blah,
Matt's right, that if you allow a story to build and build and build, you get trapped into sort of having not called an election you never intended to call.
I think Labour is certainly thinking that way. They're quite enjoying stoking up the idea that there's going to be a May election. They're the ones briefing out that it's going to happen because for them it's win-win. Either they'd quite like to do it quite soon, frankly, or they get the bottle.
What gave it legs, though, Polly, was calling the budget for March the 6th.
Yeah.
And that seemed to pave the way for an early election being called at the end of March for May. I think that Sunak will be sort of punished either way. If he rules out May, then the sort of running down the clock, the countdown begins, the media will be chasing him all over the place, all the way to the autumn. If he doesn't rule it out and people are sort of left in sort of expectation, I look, either way, it's not great for him, but I wouldn't start speculating if I were Sunak about when the election is going to be.
We've because you've posed this question to us, we've answered it a few times. Wouldn't you both agree that, although we've each got our own choices of when you'd hold the election and which would be marginally better, it is quite marginal, I think. Where I always think when people start talking about turnout effects and the effects of dates and, whether it matters whether the local elections is before or after a date, these things do matter a bit. I think they are pretty much... My guess would be they're pretty marginal.
The mayor local government elections, if they are a disaster, they'll be very demotivating for the Conservative Party.
That makes a difference.
It's not a lovely backdrop against which to launch an autumn campaign. But I also think the public are getting increasingly fretful and irritated by their expectation or their knowledge that an election is going to come this year. They're feeling that it is necessary to start a new chapter, and that's been deliberately postponed by the Tories for their own self-interest.
So that's why I argue, as you know, that they would be better off having a May election for all those reasons. But I wouldn't say the effect will be that big compared to the other things that we've discussed and we will discuss that will influence the results, the outcome of the election. It has an impact, but I would say it was marginal.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly true, unless something big happens. And I think the Conservatives are hoping that something big might happen that shifts the political atmosphere. But of course, it could be a thing that makes life better for them, but it could just as easily be a catastrophe that makes life worse for them.
I think what's more important, both for Starmer and Sunak, is not to speculate about when the election is going to be, but to start sort of framing in their minds what the question is that they want to see uppermost in the voters' mind as they go into the polling booth whenever the election is called. And that framing should start now. Indeed, I gather it's going to start this week because both of them are going to make speeches.
They're all out and about. So, Keir Starmer's going to make a speech. Rishi Sunak is going to go and speak to real people. They're going
Very
to
risky, I'd say.
let Rishi be Rishi. which we were sort of at that point in the doom loop of somebody who's a long way behind in the polls, where we were told to let Gordon be Gordon, let Ed be Ed, go out and meet. Don't talk to the media. We've got to go and speak to real. If only everyone could meet Rishi Sunak in person.
Yeah.
So
And Gordon met Gillian Duffy in Rochdale.
Can I ask this question of both of you, because it's more difficult for me because I know and like him to judge this. Do you think that's good advice to Rishi Sunak? So to Gordon Brown, I didn't think it was very good advice. Let Gordon be Gordon, and it certainly wasn't very good advice to Ed Miliband. Let Ed Miliband be Ed Miliband. I mean, it's all that you can do.
Try and start the year being a little fair to Ed Miliband, will you, Danny?
What I'm saying is, it's all you can do, it was also the problem for my, somebody I very, very much admire, William Hague. It wasn't letting William Hague be William Hague, which was all that you could do. It wasn't going to move people. Do you think that if Rishi Sunak does get across his personality, it's a plus for him? In other words, this advice, let Sunak be Sunak, get across to real people. Let's put aside the question of whether he should or shouldn't do that. Let's assume that he does it. Would that help him?
But I think we're jumbling up two things. The let Sunak be Sunak, let Bartlett be Bartlett thing, right? Is one thing that you cannot, in the end, make a person with one kind of character be different. You can't make Boris Johnson do his red box at night. You can't make Keir Starmer very funny. That you can only be your authentic self, and you're probably best when you do that. But why is that the same as get out and talk to the voters one-to-one? Because, someone like Bill Clinton was amazing one-to-one, greeting people, doing town halls, could change the mood of a room, and you would get footage of that personableness. Rishi Sunak's authentic character has many strengths to it, but they're not personableness with members of the public that he meets in the street. So I just don't understand why the two things have been equated.
I agree with Polly. I think that if Sunak does this, he will come across, as he usually does when he's with people, sort of awkward and rehearsed. I think that's the problem. I think he's got to do something rather different. I think he's got to construct a case for Sunak, for his government, and for the re-election of the Conservative Party, and he needs to start that this week.
So there's this thought that this all comes from this let Bartlett be Bartlett, but in fact it comes from
It doesn't.
It comes from let Reagan be Reagan, and let Reagan be Reagan, which was the original use of this phrase, was a campaign by the right in the Conservative Party against his more centrist advisors that Reagan should be his authentic conservative self. Let Reagan be Reagan. Yeah. The reason that I think let Ed Miliband, for example, be Ed Miliband is I think authentically Ed Miliband was well to the left of where he then decided to present himself, and therefore it wasn't good advice for him. And I think also with Gordon Brown, letting Gordon Brown actually be what he really was would have also moved him, against, for example, the agenda of sort of more austere spending that Alistair Darling put in place. So it was not good advice to him. And the question about whether letting Sunak be Sunak is good advice is not so much let Sunak be Sunak would make him look awkward. It's the question of whether him expressing his authentic politics.
Danny, what would it be?
Exactly, that's exactly the question.
What would it be?
We've already got a slight problem in him going out and being completely spontaneous with members of the public on Thursday. We've been told in advance what he's going to say because they briefed the Times today, Tuesday, which sort of slightly undermines the idea he's just going to spontaneously react.
Yes, but I don't think that's what it means. I think letting Sunak be Sunak, as far as I was concerned, would be to let him say what he really thinks. So what do I think his actual politics are? I think he is quite small state conservative. So he's a fiscal conservative, and I've always said to him, you're a fiscal conservative like I am, but you're at a lower level of public spending and tax than I am. I think he's relatively socially liberal. I think he's quite conventional in terms of the rule of law, and not doesn't have a populist position. So he'd be resistant to make, for example, woke. The wokey-cokey, in which he'd be more likely to be out than in. he's less likely to make that as sort of centerpiece. I think some of this tech bro stuff that he's accused of, he regards as an asset and would project. So the question is whether that combination, given the Conservatives' position, is really a viable one for him. It probably isn't.
Polly, do you think Rishi Sunak would be doing better if he'd got Dominic Cummings on board, as we discovered he discussed at the weekend of the Sunday Times?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. The first is, would he be better in terms of his policy stance? You know, as far as Cummings has briefed it out, it's something to do with cutting taxes and putting more money into the NHS, which was the sort of reality-defying
That's what everyone wants. Lower taxes and more money.
Okay, well, exactly. But at the core of what Boris Johnson was sort of attempting to pull off. And I certainly think that from a political perspective, that is appealing to the public. It is, of course, not really possible to pull off. And both as a personality level and also then in terms of setting up a policy conflict with his party, I think that he would just be struggling so badly to hold that Conservative parliamentary party together if he had brought this kind of public enemy number one for quite a lot of them back into the tent, especially when he promised explicitly that he wouldn't.
I look at it in a slightly different way. I mean, first of all, I think that bringing outsiders, into the tent and asking them from, they have a detachment. They can offer a helicopter view, and they're sometimes much better at sort of expressing a direct, clear-cut view than some of the people inside the tent have grown accustomed to doing. And I think that what the Conservatives need is a clarity of purpose and strategy. They need cut-through. And that means a very clear, decisive conclusion about what sort of campaign they're going to mount, what the question is they want to be uppermost in voters' minds when they go into the polling booth. And I think that, toxic as he is, he is a fairly practiced and well-experienced campaigner, Cummings, and I think he could bring that clarity. Another thing he could bring is this. What he shares with Rishi Sunak is an intense dislike of Boris Johnson and of Liz Truss. And you see, what I think about Sunak is that he's got to get that cut through, he's got to reconstruct a narrative, a story about himself, rooted in his time as Chancellor and his early time as Prime Minister, where he was clearing up the mess created and left for him by Johnson and Truss. Now, I think, therefore, in order to make the case for Sunak and all the remedial action and policies he adopted after the disaster of those two prime ministers, he's got to contrast himself with those prime ministers. He's got to show what he did to clear up the mess. Now, that is not comfortable for the party, but I do think it's something that the country would appreciate and would like to hear. And they would much better see the case for Sunak as not Johnson, not Truss, the guy who cleared up things after they'd gone. That would sort of strike home to them much better than sort of, are you a small state, big state, what level of taxation? He's got to say something that the public will understand.
Yeah,
I would agree with that. And so the question is, let Sunak be Sunak is different from let Sunak be Cummings, and that's very important, right? Because you can see from the things that Dominic Cummings is not saying in this weekend, bring me in and we'll together devise a strategy that will work. He says, I've got a strategy, and if you want to adopt it, you should bring me in. But it's not a strategy that sits comfortably with who Rishi Sunak is.
That is the risk of Cummings.
Yes, it's only one of the risks of Cummings. But get it out just to be clear, Dominic Cummings is very clear thinking and clever, and I've personally, I read a lot of his stuff. I find it completely compelling, but he wouldn't be my first choice as my kind of aide and confidant, just because of the record that he's got.
Can I ask you a question,
he's much
Dan?
better at writing these things down than he is at that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you think Cummings would say to Sunak, there are two variations of a theme here for your campaign. One is, Britain's turning a corner, it's getting better, don't let Labour ruin it. It's a risk with Labour, but premised on Britain's sort of going in the right direction? Or should he just say, look, we all know, not say literally, we all know that Britain's gone to hell in a handcart. We're in a serious mess here. It's going to take everything, we've got to throw at this to make it better. Better the devil you know in the Conservatives than the devil you don't
I think
in
he
Labour.
would say, Britain's going to hell in a handcart, don't let Labour ruin it. So I do find it's somewhat an inconsistent message.
Now, obviously, we've talked a lot about what's happening in the election, we assume, this year, unless you believe polling is going to happen in 2025. But let's talk about, because it's one of the biggest election years in history, because more than 60 countries representing half the world's population, some 4 billion people, will hold some sort of regional, legislative and presidential elections this year. So we asked you all to bring in an election to talk about. And Polly, the one you've chosen comes first. So let's start with you.
So on the 13th of January, the 26 million citizens, I guess probably not the children, but are going to the polls in Taiwan. The president from the Democratic Progressive Party, Tsai Ing-wen, is stepping down at the end of her term of office. And it's basically a competition between the DPP, the Green coalition, who are broadly pro-independence for Taiwan, and the two blue parties, the KMT, Kuomintang, apologies to all East Asian listeners for my terrible accent, and the Taiwanese People's Party. Now, there was, in the autumn of last year, a sort of lengthy discussion between those two blue parties who are more pro-China, potentially pro-reunification, though it's quite complicated, about joining a ticket, because between them they might have enough votes to be able to defeat the DPP, which would be, of course, geostrategic importance, because this status of Taiwan, which China claims ownership of, and where the US has this strategic ambiguity about whether they would protect Taiwan against a Chinese invasion. Those coalition talks fell apart, and so there are now 3 candidates. And it did look like the DPP would be a kind of a shoo-in, but actually the polls have narrowed. It's only 11 days from now. It seems it's possible that the DPP won't win, but the whole debate is being massively affected by, I think, what we're seeing increasing numbers of elections, which is disinformation, misinformation, AI-generated content dominating social media, including on TikTok, and a lot of concern that is being driven by China in order to get a more Chinese-friendly government installed in Taiwan.
I mean, from our point of view, I think the outcome of the Taiwan election that we want is one that supports the status quo, which is neither pro-independence or pro-reunification. Supports the status quo, because that's the only one that will give stability to that part of the world and for the rest of us.
But it's so interesting the way that elections being played out. There's been lots of disinformation from overseas, and actually one of the big defining questions is outward looking. Normally we think of elections being very domestic and, taxes and schools and hospitals, but like a fundamental question of your place in the world being on the ticket.
The tension, as you can imagine, from reporting in Taiwan, is incredibly high, both because of the context of Ukraine, where a more Western-aligned government came into conflict essentially with Russia and led to a Russian invasion, and also, of course, the escalations that we've seen in Hong Kong over the last several years in terms of China's relationship there.
Well, in fact, you mentioned Ukraine, so come back a bit closer to home, and the EU elections taking place to the European Parliament this year. This is your pick, Peter, in June.
My pick, because all of the 27 member states of the European Union will be having elections this year for the European Parliament. It may not be an overwhelming turnout, but there will be, in effect, a referendum in each of those countries on the performance of their national governments. It will be like a sort of midterm verdict that's being offered. And I think from what you can see at the moment, if you look at the sort of big 4 member states, in Germany, the centre-right and far-right AfD look as if they're doing well. In France, Macron running out of steam slightly, and the far-left party headed by Le Pen ahead in the polls. Italy, Meloni doing well with her far-right group. The only one of the 4 is Spain, which has a sort of left-led government, and the left may well do better in Spain from a very low base from the previous election. And I think the outcome is going to be this. You will see the centre parties, and the Greens doing less well than they want, somewhat in retreat, and the further right parties gaining. And I think the implication of that for policy is that migration will become an even bigger issue in Europe than it is at the moment. I would say it's broadly about number one on the EU's agenda and will remain so for the next 4 years. But I think the other consequence is that with the Greens sort of slightly receding, I think that those parties on the right who are concerned about the costs of the net zero transition, the energy transition, on businesses and consumers, will start to sort of quibble, and they'll be saying, look, come on, is this the best way? Does it have to be done at this breakneck speed? Does it have to be done with these costs? Can't we wait for sort of technology and innovation to emerge to see whether we can do this in a simpler way? I'm not saying there's going to be a lowering of ambition, but I think the influence that they will have will lead to a reconsideration of the route and the speed that change takes place.
The interesting thing will be whether we can discern patterns at all, because often it just moves about in all sorts of countries due to domestic factors. That one of the most, hilarious bits of television I've ever done was being on the BBC's European election night special, and it was honestly 2:30 in the morning, and Emily Mellis was in front of this big map explaining to people that there'd been a shift from the Latvian People's Front to the People's Front of Latvia, and I was sort of having, and then they would come to me to comment, and I didn't know who either of these parties were.
You didn't think that my distillation was simple enough.
The truth is, I think you're right. So I think there will be a shift towards populism on the right, partly because there is this shift going on in general in what the right-wing electorates are as they move from sort of more business-orientated parties to parties with a larger rural working class support, which they've always had. It's just a question of emphasis. They've always had that to some extent.
It's really interesting. Obviously, it's the first ones where we haven't taken part after we accidentally took part in 2019 because Theresa May forgot to leave in time. Danny, you've picked out, because you wrote in your column, in your Times column, it's the American election, not the British election, which has the greater capacity to tear our ship of state from its moorings.
Yeah, I feel a bit clunking after you've both chosen such sophisticated examples
to be true.
I went for the blindingly obvious, but I do, despite sort of getting embarrassed when I saw what you were going to choose and thinking maybe I should choose something more exotic, I've come back to this because I do think it is pretty critical. Yeah. I think, so there are some people who think Dominic Cummings, Donald Trump will certainly not be elected, as that was a Freudian slip. Donald Trump will certainly not be elected because he is he's so obviously unsuitable for office. He's going to be halfway to jail by then and prosecuted. He's too old. It's obvious he's going mad. That sort of thing. I've had all that since I wrote my column. I absolutely do not think you can rule out the really quite large chance that he will win the presidency, because he will very likely be the Republican candidate. I think that's overwhelmingly likely. And then if you're the Republican candidate and there's a Democrat president, you've got a very good chance of winning. And if he did win, the consequences for the Western Alliance, which he would then be the sort of the de facto leader, just because of their defence expenditure and our historical links, will be in crisis, and this will affect everything that we do on the world stage.
Can I tell you about the WhatsApp exchange I had with the legendary Republican pollster in the United States, Frank Luntz?
Yes, please.
Over the weekend, he said of Trump, the more indictments, the higher he climbs. The more people that kick him off the ballot, the better he does. The wilder the claims, the more positive the responses. The truth is, we are spiralling downward and there is no bottom.
Yeah.
And then end up, so shall we do an interview together on this? So we might have him on.
Interestingly, Frank at one point kind of championed the sort of cause of like Ross Perot and the kind of populist stream, and he then came to the conclusion it was incredibly destructive.
Yeah,
I think it's partly because of the international influence of it.